And good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the fastest 2 hours in radio. This is going to seem even faster this morning because we have two gentlemen here in the studio, Peter Tedeschi and Bill Keating, William Keating, who's the current congressman. Peter is challenging him as a Republican for, let's see, in Congress to represent our district. And our debate today is going to be on foreign policy, which is important because it is often overlooked. It's often overlooked, yet it's the thing we often discuss after the fact, right? I mean, it's really the thing we discuss after the fact. Everyone says, well, how do we get into Vietnam, which none of these gentlemen had anything to do with. But how do we get into Vietnam? How did we end up in the Middle East? How did we end up with trade agreements? How do these things happen? And the historians often write them. And that's, in some respects, because although the candidates want to talk about this stuff, they're often not given a forum to discuss this because of today's media, where we just go for the, for the O.J. Simpsons and the things like that. So today, we're going to slow it down, quiet it down a little bit, and have a deep discussion about foreign policy. Before we do that, we're going to let the candidates just, talk a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves to the audience, and try to give us a world view here a little bit. Now, the one thing we do have to do is, Tim, we haven't flipped coins yet, have we? No. We haven't flipped a coin yet.
Does anyone use coins anymore?
I have a coin. It's a Bitcoin, but I have a coin. Challenger, you want heads or tails, or do you want to give it to...
I'll let the...
Heads or tails?
Heads.
It's heads. Heads. Do you like to start or finish? Yeah. Hit drop. It's an example of my technical abilities. Neither one of you would ever want to hire me.
Sure, I'll start.
You'll start. Okay. Huh? All right. So give us your opening a little bit about yourself. We can condense that to about a minute.
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you and your listeners for having this. Foreign Affairs does strike home quite a bit. I'm ranking member on the Foreign Affairs Committee on Terrorism, Trade, Non-Proliferation, and on Homeland Security. That's the focus of my committee work in D.C., so these issues do ring true. I'll tell you, they hit home here. The trade agreement, for instance, had effect locally in this area already. Those tariffs that are being imposed not only have affected the cranberry industry, which we were able to stave off $34 million in additional revenue that would have been taken from that industry by my work through the EU, but also companies like Airvox and 47 brand hats and Titcom Brothers and Westport and those companies and a lot of other companies have contacted our office because they're saying how they're affected by these tariffs. And some of them are saying they're wondering how seriously it will affect their business and whether they stay in business if these tariffs continue. So just as an opening, wanted to tell you that thank you for doing this. These things hit home. They have real impact in jobs right here in the greater New Bedford area.
All right, and now Peter Tedeschi, the challenger.
Chris, thanks a lot. Congressman, thanks for being here today. Pleasure to be here. My wife, Kathy, and I are lifelong residents of the district. Been here our whole lives. I'm the former president and CEO of my family's business, Tedeschi Food Shops. And, look, running for Congress, it's an opportunity for me to give back to an area that I'm proud to call home, and one that has allowed my family, starting with my immigrant grandparents at the turn of the last century, to realize the American dream. And, like so many others, I am also concerned with what I see taking place on Capitol Hill today. A lot of partisan gridlock that's preventing work getting done. And we have too many elected officials that are more interested in doing the bidding of their party and supporting special interest groups than doing the work of the people. Congressman Keating's a 41-year career politician, 4 terms as a congressman, our congressman. I believe in term limits, too. I've agreed to serve no more than 3 terms if elected, and would push for term limits because I do believe we wouldn't have a lot of the problems we have today on Capitol Hill if we had term limits in place. Partisan politics, the congressman heard you say it before, he ranks as the most partisan member of the Mass delegation. I want to change that in Capitol Hill, and I want to represent the people. Get back to work for the people. All
right. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your opening statements. All right. So, as I told the audience from the start, we're going to concentrate here on foreign policy. Of course, foreign policy obviously has implications domestically as well for it. One of the big employers that we have in our area is the defense industry. The defense industry in New England is a tremendous employer. Many people right in this district work and live in this district, employed in the defense industry, or work in the surrounding area, but nonetheless employed in the defense industry. There are always calls to reduce the defense budget from different quarters in this country. So I'd like you to explain your thoughts on defense funding, and also about allowing American companies to sell arms to foreign governments, obviously friendly foreign governments, or what we believe to be friendly foreign governments at the time that we sell them the weapons. Mr. Tedeschi, you can start.
So relative to selling to foreign governments, I'm assuming you're probably touching on what's going on right now with our allies, the Saudis. And so first and foremost, our morality cannot be for sale. But one of the things we need to do is take sort of a longer view of issues like this rather than reacting and having a knee-jerk reaction. And at the end of the day, what we really want to do is we want to try to ensure that the United States, as a global leader, is able to have a measure of influence. That we're able to pull levers to really get countries, allies, and folks that aren't allies, to behave in a way that we think is appropriate. And so the question I would ask is, for example, in the case of Saudi Arabia, is not selling them arms going to be one of the ways? Is that going to help us to encourage them to change their behavior? And by the way, they've been doing this for a long time. It's reprehensible what just transpired, but it's not new. And so I would ask the question, is not selling them arms going to allow us or give us more or less leverage over them to get them to behave the way that we think is commensurate with countries like the United States in terms of how we treat our journalists, the way we treat our people, and I think that's what we really need to start talking about, and best way to leverage our strength.
Excellent. Congressman Keating, to you again the question: defense industry jobs here in selling defense systems to foreign governments, allowing our companies to do it.
Well, the defense industry does have a place in jobs in our area. Just to give you an example, the Blue Wave, the new Blue Wave grant that we got with the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth, that we did with Bristol Community College, Mass Maritime, also included industries like Lockheed. So Lockheed, a defense contractor, is going to be part of building new jobs here in the southern Massachusetts area. And that's important. Those are next generation jobs, and they're important. Jobs with the Navy. There's research that's being done with SMAST and other organizations. Those are jobs and critical to our area. So I'm very involved in working to create new jobs here and job training. There is a place for arms sale with our allies. Part of the reason for that, however, is just not to make money on the arms. It's to build relationships. If you're selling those arms, you have to train that military. You build those kind of relationships. That is part of the goal. And that's why we should be selective about dealing with that. Congress does have a role often in that. Now, when it comes to Saudi Arabia right now and what's happened, that arms deal, which is not $110 billion, as the president said, he's not telling the truth. It's $14 billion that's already, been approved. Those monies for arms, we should not be supporting arms sales right now to Saudi Arabia with what happened. Our country is a country that was founded on ideas, and those ideas included freedom, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. And when it wasn't founded on the idea of selling arms. So there's a reason to get involved in that. That's in our own self-interest. There are avenues to take to avoid getting involved with the countries where those sales could not result in our interest, where we provided Saudis weapons that they used to kill 40 students on a school bus in Yemen, and then say they did it because it was a terrorist target. So we have some real serious questions facing us with Saudi Arabia, but back home, those jobs can be created here in southern Massachusetts.
Thank you. So we have a spin-off from that. You gentlemen brought up Saudi Arabia. About 35 years old, literally 35 years ago, last month, a U.S. congressman was actually murdered by the Soviets. They blew his plane up. KLA, the Korean airliner Larry McDonald, was a Democrat from Georgia. And there was a lot of hot talk, 1983, a lot of hot talk about the Soviets and what we were going to do with them and whether we were going to continue with arms agreements, trade agreements. And yet ultimately, we continued forward negotiating with the Soviet Union, despite a lot of hot talk. There was really nothing was done. This is obviously should hit home for both of you. That was a United States congressman who was killed by the Soviets, along with I think 22 other Americans on that airline. Keeping in mind with the Saudi Arabia topic, does it make sense to it may sound crass, but over one person's death or a couple people's death, blow up, not literally, but blow up entire relationships with important governments, even if they are hostile? This to you, Congressman.
Well, I recall that incident, reading about it. He was on his way to Seoul to commemorate, I think, 30 years of the agreement with South Korea, which brings things into perspective today, too. The Soviet Union at the time, he was a fierce critic of the Soviet Union, one of the most fierce critics. And it was known that he was going on, to participate in this. So it raised questions of whether this was intentional or not at the time. A serious issue. And one that the Soviets said that they would investigate themselves. And I think when you rely on that kind of investigation yourself, you're going to come into the problems that you talked about. What's happened now in Saudi Arabia, we can't just rely. I mean, Jared Kushner, someone we've talked about in this program before, but Jared Kushner said, well, we're still looking into it. He's been in conversation, reportedly, with the Crown Prince. What's the nature of those conversations? What's being said? He shouldn't be doing that. Yesterday, we saw our Treasury Secretary pose for a picture with the Crown Prince, sending the message it's okay with the U.S. This is serious. Germany, France have cut back their sales of arms to Saudi Arabia and suspended those. We should do it too, because this is critical. This is a pattern with the Saudis. They moved ahead and did a blockade of Qatar, where we have our CENTCOM command in the Middle East, without telling us. He had a foreign minister from Lebanon kidnapped. I mentioned too about what he's done in Yemen, drawing us in. He's not been trustworthy with us, and he's clearly feels he with impunity he can take these actions. That's no ally for us. And so when we're looking at this issue, who is truly our ally? I've questioned and had hearings about the Saudis because they said they were going to take these textbooks that they're educating children with in terms of extremist activity and move it away. They're not doing it, and I'm holding their feet to the fire, and I'll hold their feet to the fire on this too.
Thank you, Congressman. The challenger, Peter Tedeschi, your answer on that question. So
again, our morality cannot be for sale, no doubt about it. And I think one of the things you're going to find during this time together here is, the issue of foreign policy, foreign affairs, and doing the right thing. It's not a Republican, it's not a Democratic issue, it's not a Republican issue, it's an American issue. So I think there's probably a lot of common grounds. My question is, I don't want to be short-sighted about how we react. We should not react to situations like this. We need to respond. And what that means is looking at the longer view and understanding, are the things that we do, the actions we're taking, going to allow us to positively influence and exert pressure, pull those levers, if you will, to get these countries to behave in a way we think is responsible and appropriate. And when it comes to the Saudis, a couple of things. Look, the Middle East is very unstable. It's been that way for a long time. We need to do everything we can to ensure it is stable, because nearly half the free world's oil flows through the Middle East, the Straits of Hormuz more specifically. And so we need to do everything we can. However, I don't think any options are off the table relative to exerting pressure to get the Saudis to behave.
Excellent. Okay. At this point, gentlemen, we'll take a break for a little crass commercial break here. A profit-making enterprise. But we'll be right back, folks. You're listening to Peter Tedeschi and Congressman Bill Keating, both candidates here in our area for Congress, and we're discussing foreign policy. When we get back, folks, we're going to discuss China. Well, stick around here on 1420 WBSM. All right, welcome back to the show. I'm Chris McCarthy. We are conducting our foreign policy debate here. We have Congressman Bill Keating, the Democrat incumbent for Congress, and we have his challenger, Peter Tedeschi, a businessman, Republican challenger for that seat. As I mentioned, before we went to the break, we're going to discuss China a little bit here. So one of the big things that China has been doing is they've been making incursions into our hemisphere. And they have been doing that through multiple administrations. We see that China has built a very large space station in Argentina. Incredible, weird deal that they did down there. We've also seen that China has been able to convince 3 countries, El Salvador, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, to break their ties with Taiwan, which of course is an affront to the United States. It's, you know, that's our aircraft carrier there out there in the China Sea. So starting with you, Mr. Tedeschi, what are your thoughts on China's incursion into our hemisphere, into Latin and South America?
I think it's very concerning. And, you know, one of the things we need to keep in mind is the fact that China is probably one of our most important relationships that we have. Obviously, we have a large amount of debt that we take from China, that we borrowed from China, and they're our biggest trade partner. I mean, we need to keep that in mind, but we also need to keep them in check. They are flexing their muscles, and I think we'll probably get into it later when we start talking about the nuclear deal with Russia, and the fact that while Russia and the United States have been pointing fingers at each other relative to who's breaking that deal that Gorbachev and Reagan signed, I think the problem is China has sort of gone unchecked to grow their military and to really flex their muscles in our hemisphere and beyond. And by the way, also potentially restricting travel in and around China, so the Southeast Sea. So we need to be very mindful of that, but we also need to understand that we need to be diplomatic, because that is a very important relationship that we have today.
Anything more? No? Okay. All right, great. Congressman Keating, the question goes to you. China's incursion into Latin America, South America, and their investments that they've made there, and the diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Your thoughts, sir?
This is a really important issue. It's one that, as ranking member on my subcommittee, we're involved with directly. It's just not in our hemisphere, but around the world. But in our hemisphere, for instance, they built a massive hydroelectric plant in Ecuador. That is 35% of the country's energy that comes from that. 2 nuclear plants in Argentina, 152-mile-long motorway in Colombia, and a connecting port in Brazil. It has 23% stake in Brazil's 3rd largest energy firm. So these are things that I have in committee. These are just the ones that I've noted just in our hemisphere. But 2 things. Number one, they're getting a footprint here. I was talking to the president of all places, Costa Rica. You wouldn't think, and by chance I said, is China there? And they started telling me everything that's going on. So it's not only their presence, but the way they're doing it that's important. They're going to these countries and they're shortchanging the way that approvals are done and everything, and they have agreements with balloon payments. So what happens is they suck these countries in, giving them a deal they can't get anywhere else, promising them local employment, which they renege on every time, but then they have them this great indebtedness put into place in these countries. Now they have a stranglehold over the economy in those countries. That's serious stuff. What I've done, I'm an original co-sponsor of the BUILD Act that's now law. And what we're doing is making it easier for the United States to compete with China in these countries. We just can't stop this from happening, but what we can do is compete against them and be successful in doing it. That's the approach, and that's one of my priorities in Congress, is to do that, because China represents a great threat to us economically, and it'll affect our national security as a result.
Just focusing, continuing here with China, because they are, so as both of you gentlemen have pointed out, so important and such a challenge to us. Congressman Keating, we have established better relationships with Vietnam. I was shocked when the Trump administration gave them, I believe, a Coast Guard cutter or a Coast Guard ship recently to Vietnam, and we're now building a stronger relationship with Vietnam with the idea that we can check the Chinese to some degree, or keep ports over there. What are your thoughts on relations with Vietnam?
They're critical, because Vietnam is suffering from Chinese incursions, both economically and what they're doing security-wise. They're advancing the in the South China Sea, where they're there's real land in dispute, and I don't think it's in dispute with the aggressiveness of China is just coming in, taking away Vietnam land and property and ocean areas. So this is real. How do we attack this the best way? Well, we do it by having a strong coalition in the Pacific militarily. It's something that I think has been undercut a little bit during these North Korea negotiations, the strength of Japan and the U.S. and South Korea in particular. But we also do it economically, and Vietnam is a key piece in that. In trade, which again is part of my subcommittee, it's important to develop these partnerships to really counter China's influence. We have to stand up to the plate and compete, and Vietnam is critical in that regard. You know, our relationships have changed greatly. Just last year, a continuing effort to get the remains of our soldiers who lost their lives there, resulting in 16 more soldiers' remains being discovered. Vietnam's cooperating at every level with us now, but we have to engage them and make strong alliances with them and other Asian Pacific countries to be able to compete and thwart China's activities, which is aggressive economically, but also increasingly aggressive militarily.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. We now turn to Peter Tedeschi, his Republican challenger here for the congressional seat. Sir, I asked the question of Vietnam, our relations with Vietnam. Your thoughts on that?
Very important, and I think it shows, look, it wasn't so long ago that we were at war with Vietnam, and I think it shows that what can be done when we put our minds to it. This is a perfect example of us taking a longer view of things, and if you look at it this way, Chris, it's sort of turning things around. If you look at what China's doing in South America, we just talked about that a few minutes ago, it's us sort of doing the same thing where we're developing relationships in China's neighborhood, if you will. And I think it's important, and it's important that we do keep free trade in the East China Sea and things like that, because China is definitely trying to flex their muscles. It is very important, and it shows a willingness on behalf of the United States to let diplomacy rule and to allow us to achieve our objectives.
Thank you. We're now going to stay over in that part of the world. Let's talk a little bit about Korea, what's going on in Korea, North Korea, South Korea, the relations there. I think most of us have been surprised, I guess, that the way the president has been able to handle this, the way it started so aggressive, and where we are today, where they're back and forth. But so it's in flux. I think the audience recognizes that as they listen to both of you gentlemen's answers. But starting with you, Mr. Tedeschi, what are your thoughts on Korea, North Korean relations, American relations with North Korea, and where we are?
Well, first of all, look, let's make no mistake about it. North Korea, there's a brutal dictatorship that's taking place right there. Their people are being oppressed, and it's been a very much of a closed country. I think that our overtures and gestures to them are having some benefit for sure. And again, at the end of the day, Chris, it's what is it we're trying to do? And for us, it's how do we exert our influence? We have not engaged in North Korea since we had boots in the ground during the Korean conflict. By the way, the Korean War is still officially underway, has not been officially ceased yet. But I think what we've shown is, look, we've been able to get remains back of some of the men that died fighting for our country over there. There are now open negotiations that will hopefully help diminish the capability and the willingness of North Korea to develop nuclear weapons that could potentially be used against us or some of our allies in the region. Those are all very good things, but make no mistake about it, our engaging with them can no way be misconstrued as accepting the way they're doing business today, and hopefully it'll be an opportunity for us to change the way they do business today.
Thank you, Mr. Tedeschi. Congressman Keating, your thoughts on North Korea, our relations with North Korea, the relations with South Korea?
There was marginal benefit in beginning the negotiations. It's always great to talk. I think it's cooled things down. When I was in South Korea, meeting with General Vincent Brooks, who's in charge not only of our troops, but also with the UN forces at the border, he was saying the greatest day-to-day threat was at the border. I think the discussions with President Moon in the South, and Kim Jong-un in the North, have helped that border tension. So that's the good side of the picture. The bad side of the picture is this. We've undercut our relationships with South Korea and Japan working together, which is the strength that we have in the area. You know, our ally as president shouldn't be awakened in the middle of the night and being told the U.S. president just said we're cutting military exercises together, and they're finding out as the news media is telling them. You don't operate like that. And it's caused a rift with Japan. It's not public, but I talk to people behind the scenes, and it's very real. What we have to do is, in the nuclear front, not do what we're doing now. we had the meeting, and you know what's happened in North Korea? They've increased their nuclear fissile energy capacity. They've gone ahead and sped forward with that. Since that negotiation, since that meeting, that's taken us backwards. If we're going to be successful, we have to do two things. Up front, we have to identify where these sites are. And number two, we have to have a plan where we can verify what's happening. And that has to be done internationally. So until we get to that step, we're not going to have success moving forward on the nuclear front.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. We have been discussing all foreign policy issues. Folks, we're not taking calls during this debate. We're going to manage this. In the next hour, when the gentlemen have left for their next engagements, I will take your calls and get your opinions on this debate. But at this time, we're not going to take any phone calls. Congressman Keating, as we take this tour around the world, Russia, this is, since we've been it seems like we've been in conflict with Russia since forever, right? I mean, back before they were even communists. But now, today, what are your views on Russia, our relationships with Russia? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong?
Well, we're going to have communications with Russia. And we have to also differentiate the Russian people from their leadership, too, as we go forward. But they're a hostile country to us. They're engaging themselves in Afghanistan in a malign way. With terrorist activity there, causing problems. With Iran and the alliance they have with it, they've created problems in our area. But they also attacked us and attacked our elections. And, we haven't been successful in dealing with this. The Mueller investigation has produced over 30 indictments for Russian corporations, people. Just last week, there was another one about the 2018 elections, the ones we're going to have in a couple of weeks, and how they're involved in this. We have to start being stronger with them in that at that level, and not sit there and have meetings like Helsinki, where we turn around and say, well, it could have been someone else. Just because Putin said he didn't do it doesn't mean it wasn't being done. Our intelligence is clear on that. So we have to act very strongly in that regard. The INF Treaty, which is Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, we're now there going maybe to break our way out of that. I think there were, in my opinion, I can say publicly now, I've briefed on this before, in my opinion, there were breaches of that with the Russians that have to be addressed. But we have to be careful and find common ground. We can't unravel everything we're doing. So in that instance with Russia, we have to stand up stronger than we have on the attack they had on our country. And make them pay for that. Congress was the one that moved ahead with those sanctions and made it held, I think, the president's feet to the fire with Russia in that regard. But we have to make sure that they respect us, that we're strong against them. They are not an equal of ours. They're not an equal militarily or economically. And we have the chance to flex some of those muscles while at the same time finding areas where, because of issues like Syria and trying to negotiate out of that, we're going to have to sit down across the table from them.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. Peter Tedeschi, to you, just to reiterate, so what's going on with Russia, our relations with Russia, your thoughts on that, missile treaties, trade, the elections, all of those things with Russia.
Sure. Relative to Russia, look, it is no surprise we've had this contentious relationship with Russia. At the end of World War II, a lot of our generals, including General Patton, said, listen, we're going to have to deal with them sooner or later. And so we've been dealing with them ever since. Certainly things got better under the Reagan-Gorbachev era, which was certainly a bright light that actually helped to unify Germany. And so it was sort of peace through strength, if you will. I am concerned that their continued support of Syria. Not only they provide arms, they provide intelligence. They fly their pilots over to enforce the no-fly zone. And we've seen some situations where they've been stealthy and not told us when they've got pilots up in the air that have almost resulted in us shooting down some of their aircraft. That's not a good thing. Relative to the nuclear treaty, as the congressman pointed out, they have been proven to not be honest about their dealings with it. So my general feeling about things like this, whether it's this treaty or other agreements the United States engages in, we are supposed to be the leader in the free world. And as such, we shouldn't just summarily pull out of a treaty. We need to seize the opportunity to try to make it better, address the issues of concern, make a treaty better tomorrow than it is today. And, I think that's what we should be doing here. I don't think we should just pull out.
Great. We're doing our foreign policy debate here. I'll tell you what we'll do is we'll take a quick break here. pay a couple bills, and we come back. We'll continue our discussion with the two gentlemen. We have Peter Tedeschi, candidate for Congress, Republican, and the current Congressman Bill Keating, Democrat. We'll be right back. Stick around here on 1420 WBSM.
I'm going.
All right, welcome back. I'm Chris McCarthy. We have Peter Tedeschi and Congressman Bill Keating here in studio discussing a tour around the world. We're taking a tour around the world for you folks at home because, look, I think some of this stuff is really ignored. These are the most important issues. If you think about it, we have monuments all over the city to people who, because of foreign policy decisions, good or bad, never came home. So that's why it really is so important. Now, focusing back a little bit on our hemisphere, Venezuela. Venezuela has plunged into a socialist nightmare. They have incredible natural resources, yet they can't feed their people. The problems in Venezuela are causing incredible migration problems in Brazil and in Colombia. Colombia being one of our best allies, soon to be joining NATO. So the impact on stabilized countries, and we know the problems that Colombia has had over the years, but is now stabilized relatively. But having an influx of any foreign population into your country is destabilizing. I believe this question goes to Peter. I believe this question goes to you to start. If I messed up, I'm sorry. Venezuela, your thoughts on Venezuela? What can we do about Venezuela and their border with Colombia?
So
oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So we have not had a very good working relationship with Venezuela for quite a while, and they have great natural oil reserves, natural gas, and things like that. But look, I think part of what we have to do is when we see there to be a possibility for there to be an unstable situation in our hemisphere. We certainly look at it globally too. We need to figure out what we can do to help influence that. A, it's the right thing to do, but B, if you want to be selfish about it, what are we going to do to make it so that people are willing to stay where they live as opposed to looking to escape perhaps into this country or others? That's not good for anybody. You know, I think it starts with negotiations, starts with opening a dialogue and making sure, and to sort of lower the rhetoric, and to make sure we're able to have constructive conversations with them and just be very candid with each other. And also relative to Colombia, look, you know, I think as a friend of ours, I think we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing to help protect them where they're right in the border as well. And so we certainly owe it to them. And, you know, but I think it's good for the United States as the leader of the free world to engage ourselves to help stabilize countries, particularly ones that are in our hemisphere.
Thank you. To you, Congressman Keating, the destabilization of Venezuela, the migration it's causing, and the destabilization in that area, to you, sir.
That's one of the most important foreign affairs issue we have right now, and it's right here in our hemisphere, and we don't pay enough attention to it, frankly. The scope of this is enormous. Because of the collapse of the economy and what's happening in Venezuela, there's like 23 million people over the last few years that have just migrated out of there over the last several years. And it's really come to a head, too, in a couple of places. One, you mentioned, is Brazil, that northern state in Brazil. I think it's, I'm not sure the pronunciation, but it's...
I won't know either.
It doesn't matter. It's a northern state in Brazil.
You get a pass.
And the influx there is incredible. It's resulted in actual altercations over the last couple of months that, stick fights out in the street with the problems that are there, the refugee camps, everything that's occurring has created enormous problems in Brazil. Over 50,000 people came there just in a year's period. But in Colombia, it's even more pronounced, where if you see the films of the Simon Bolivar Bridge, you just see miles of people waiting to get over. 440,000 people have hit there just in about a year's period, just crushing Colombia, which is a NATO country, an ally of ours. We had recently, in August, put $9 million of U.S. aid to Colombia. And we have a great relationship with Colombia. It was the model and is the model for us working together. Plan Colombia was a success. It resulted in drug interdiction. It resulted in a stable country that would have been civil war for decades. It resulted in economics. We are their #1 trade partner now. That's what we have to do in this area. It's not just a military issue for us, but it's an important one. We have to invest more, trade more, seek out those relationships, bolster our allies like Bolivia, help countries like Brazil deal with this, and hope for some stability in Venezuela, where the humanitarian issue is just extraordinary. Children dying on the streets because they can't get food or medical care.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. This question to you. Speaking of keeping people in their countries, or trying to keep their countries reasonable so that the people will stay there, we're seeing this, they're calling it a caravan of folks coming up from Central America. There are different motivations probably with each one of those people. But how do we keep countries such as Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, those countries, how do we stabilize them? What can we do to prevent, if we want to prevent, which is another question, this migration of population into our country and into Mexico, and again, the destabilizing effects? Question to you, Congressman.
Well, there's not a question if we should. We have to. One of the areas that I'm the ranking member of is dealing with terrorism. On Homeland Security, I'm also on the Counterterrorism Committee as well. These are incubators for terrorist activity and unrest. Not the type that we are thinking of necessarily, but the type that will be prone to their own type of incubation. And that's what's occurring here, right in our hemisphere. So what we have to do is key in on what's happening in those countries. And, we talked about Colombia. What we did there is a great model for what we can do as a country. We can work to stop the interdiction of drugs at its starting point. And the other thing that I've worked with too, with legislation that's moved forward, is an agreement on terrorist actions where we share information with other countries. So I've been very involved in that aspect, but these are incubators. I'm not saying it's there yet, but they'll create great instability. And we've talked about the Russians and the Chinese, how they've invested in those areas. It's in our self-interest to move forward on this. It's our self-interest to have trade and economic activity and agreements with these countries right in our own hemisphere before things get worse.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. To you, Mr. Tedeschi, just to reiterate, this caravan of migrants coming up from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and other countries in that region, coming up to the United States to flee, in many cases anyway, to flee the instability on there. What can we do to help that part of the world so the people stay there? Sure.
Well, I think we need to look at smart investment, exerting our influence, financial and otherwise, in those areas to give people a reason to stay there, as opposed to coming here. And by the way, you know, I think we need to also invest in technology. Things like there's a program out there called BitMap, Biometric Identification Transitional Migration Alert Program, which basically will help us to identify the bad actors if they try to get into this country. But the other thing, Chris, we need to do is we need to secure our border. And that's just the fact. We owe that. Number one responsibility to the folks that we elect to represent us, keep us safe. So we need to do the right thing, the humane thing, but we need to protect our border, and we need to make sure that you know, not just anyone can flow into this country.
Mr. Tedeschi, sorry for a second, folks. I was reading my notes. Mr. Tedeschi, so one of the things that we have here going on is, of course, the Brexit vote, right? So the UK pulled out of Europe, and there are discussions now about whether or not we do a separate trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Does that make sense to the United States? What are your thoughts on doing a trade agreement directly with the UK?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Brexit, I think that some of our elected officials jumped on the bandwagon, almost promoting it right out of the gates. And, you know, whether it's our relations we had with Margaret Thatcher under Reagan, Tony Blair with Bush, I think, look, we need to let them do their thing. And I don't think we should be interjecting ourselves into their affairs. Let them figure it out for themselves. You now have a lot of folks that are in the UK that want another redo. They want another vote on Brexit because now they're concerned that it could have some detrimental effects. And then that brings up instability and potential problems between Ireland and Northern Ireland. All these things, all these decisions, Chris, to your point earlier, decisions today have consequences tomorrow. And I think as one of our oldest trusted partners, we need to trust them to do the right thing for their country, their people, and their area.
Thank you. Congressman Keating, should we do a separate trade agreement with the UK in light of Brexit?
Sure. Just a quick review of Bitmap. That happened to be my bill that became law. That's a bill that I was the lead Democrat along with Republican Mike McCall from Texas. So the two of us put that bill in that Peter referenced to try and deal with terrorism. We codified Bitmap and it made that there. In Northern Ireland, I've met with the ambassadors, foreign ministers, with the UK, with the EU, with Irish officials. That is one area. We can't have that border after the Good Friday Agreement. We can't go back to those days again, and they're holding firm on that. It remains a high area of contention. When it comes to Brexit and how we're going to move forward here in terms of trade, we had a hearing in my subcommittee right off the bat where UK wanted to have their own bilateral agreement in trade with the US. They have to wait till Brexit occurs to have that happen. But we have to remember this. These bilateral agreements can provide problems here. 80% of our trade is with the rest of the EU, and they're our biggest trading partner. It's the biggest trade relationship in the world. So we have to make sure as we go forward, we're just not looking at UK alone, that we can't forget, you know, our primary benefit that helps our country the most, and that's the agreements with the EU. I'm working hard to have a free trade agreement with the European Union, a side agreement with UK for a free trade agreement. There's great bipartisan support for it. I started the so-called TTIP caucus. That's a bipartisan caucus to move forward. I'm going to continue to do that. There's a lot of interest now, given the tariff problems that are occurring back and forth, in saying, look, let's solve the problem. And you know, we've talked about China. If the EU and UK with the US have that trade agreement, we'll have over 1/2 of the world's GDP. When you have strength like that, that's when you can deal with China. That's where we can exert influence, and we should be dealing from strength. So I'm working on that, have worked on it, and will continue to work on it.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman, back to you. We discussed specifically tariffs here, trade agreements with England, the UK. What are your thoughts in a general way, but you can be as specific as you like, about the use of tariffs? A, to protect industry in the United States, if that's necessary, to create jobs, and also to use it as a way to move countries in the direction that the United States believes that they should move. What are your general thoughts on the use of tariffs?
A tariff war is a loser on both sides, and historically that's been the case. I mentioned before the companies that have come forth to us in our office saying this could actually result in our our company failing. These are jobs right here in our district. So we should look at this the way I just mentioned a moment ago. Take this opportunity and build strength. Move forward on this. Find common agreement that makes sense for the United States. Put us in a position of greater strength, and that's having a free trade agreement with the European Union and the UK. Move forward with countries like Vietnam and have trade agreements there. We are the strongest economic country in the world, the strongest military country in the world. Let's use our strength. Let's not put holes in our alliance with NATO. You know, we had a hearing recently about the threat of China, the threat of Russia, and the conclusion by all the experts were there. We have one thing that China doesn't have and Russia doesn't have. We have a coalition that we work with that makes us stronger. That coalition should move in the trade side and strengthen our economic strength. You know, don't forget this, that when our greatest generals, including General Mattis and General Dempsey before, our leaders were asked, what's the #1 issue for our national security? They've all answered, our economy. It's our economic strength that's the most important in our national security. And moving the direction we are with tariffs instead of moving in the direction we should be with free trade agreements with our strongest allies is the way to go.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. To you, Mr. Tedeschi, who, of course, you come from a finance and business background.
Sure.
So thinking of your world experience and your life experience, your general thoughts on tariffs and how they work for our country.
Generally, I think, look, tariffs need to be targeted in terms of what it is you're trying to accomplish with a tariff. In the case of China, I think it ranges a lot of things. How we're treated as a trade partner, things like theft of intellectual property that costs billions of dollars to American companies each and every single year, where basically they're just stealing our information and going out and reproducing products that should be produced by American companies. And, you know, anytime you have something like a tariff, there can be unforeseen consequences. We need to be ready to address those. Perfect example. Because of the tariffs, what the Chinese did was they imposed additional tariffs on things like cranberries. Obviously, cranberries are of huge importance to this area. And so the cranberry growers are being adversely affected by tariffs and by the trade wars. And the reason is because right now, Paul Ryan's district, one of the largest cranberry producers in the country. So we need to be smart about it. And one of the things we need to do is, rather than just folding up, we need to give cranberry growers the ability to do things like grow alternative crops where they currently can only grow cranberries today, things like that. So, but short in duration, targeted, and with a desired outcome.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so gentlemen, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, I'm going to have the big question for both of you to answer. So, folks, stick around here. We have Peter Tedeschi, GOP challenger to Congressman Bill Keating, who's the Democrat here for South Coast. We'll be right back. do
We
it.
go over. It's your show.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
It's not like another show.
So, gentlemen, we're back here. I'm Chris McCarthy. We have the debate between Peter Tedeschi and Congressman Bill Keating for this district. So, I had told you folks the big question. The big question is, and this is to you, Mr. Tedeschi, when is it, in your mind, appropriate to put U.S. soldiers in harm's way, put them on the battlefield, direct them into combat?
Well, number one responsibility of our elected officials is to keep us safe. So I would have to say, Chris, it's when our U.S. interests, our U.S. sovereignty, and our sovereignty and our country are threatened, where harm could come to this country and to the people of this country. More broader than that, also, that may include areas where we think that having stability in an area or region, something like the Middle East, unfortunately we're seeing today, is of vital importance to this country and to our allies. But the other thing I'd want to touch on is what's equally or more important to me is how we treat our veterans when they come home, and we are not doing nearly enough to support our veterans when they come home after putting their lives on the line to support our country each and every day. So I'm very focused on that as well. So it's when we have to deploy them, but make sure we're taking very good care of them when they get back.
Thank you, Mr. Tedeschi. Congressman Keating.
Well, I think Congress should adopt an authorization to use of military force. We should be responsible. People are walking away from that, and that's Congress's role. And I strongly believe that's the case. And I believe it is a family that was a Gold Star family. My grandmother was a Gold Star mother. I know that. My dad was a veterans agent for over 3 decades, and I grew up in that household. My brother served, during Vietnam. So these are all issues close to home, and the most serious decisions we make are in that regard. But Congress should make them too. It should be a collective decision.
It's over.